The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Public Finance Fiscal Responsibility Amendment Bill be now read a third time. Mr Speaker, one of the strengths of governance in New Zealand, which is internationally recognised, has been the broad political support for the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1994 and subsequent amendments to it. And if I can just remind the House of the essential structure of that Act, which we are amending. The Act sets out a set of principles for responsible, the provisions specify a set of principles for responsible fiscal management and the conduct of fiscal policy. A couple of the principles we often look to are principles that require governments first to achieve and then to maintain, for instance, prudent levels of debt. The provisions require regular public reporting by government on the extent to which fiscal policy is consistent with those principles. And third, and probably most importantly, the provisions of the current Act provide for regular independent updates from the Treasury, including a pre-election update and a statement on the long-term fiscal position every 4 years. The provisions are not prescriptive about fiscal strategy. Particularly, they don't define, for instance, what a prudent level of public debt is, recognising that different levels are appropriate in different circumstances. They essentially require transparency for the government to set out its objectives and intentions and then report against those. And in practice, I think successive New Zealand governments have found that the framework has a pretty good balance of transparency and flexibility. That is, it's well within the power of a government to change the fiscal objectives, provided that it says that that's what it's doing. That's on the one hand, but on the other hand, it does lead to systematic transparency. This kind of change, these institutional arrangements are now recognised and used internationally because of the proven benefits for fiscal management. So these amendments that we're debating today and putting through the House are simply improving what is already a well-proven framework. And I'll just pick out a couple of the amendments because I think they are quite important. One is a new reporting requirement for the government to look back and assess its performance against its fiscal strategy. Now, why does that matter? You'd think that's what would happen. Well, actually, it's not. It doesn't actually happen. What actually happens is the government announces a budget, then over the subsequent 12 months, Treasury revise their forecasts for that 12-month period at least twice, and that is at the half-year update and then at the following budget. They adjust their forecasts for the 12-month period according to the most recent information, which means that by the time you get to the end of that 12 months and the public accounts are released, the government is actually comparing the actual outturn with the most recent Treasury forecasts, which could be 2 cycles away from the original budget. This tends to hide significant variations from what the budget was. So, for instance, the outturn for the 12-13 year will be compared in the first instance under the usual framework with the most recent Treasury forecast, which was actually done just in May. And you can imagine the forecast done in May will show a much smaller variance against the end year figures than the forecast done in the budget 12 months ago. So it hides variation. It also means that government is not inclined to look into what actually happened over that 12 months to understand whatever significant shift, what was driving any significant shifts. And it's not prompted to do that because the variances look small. So in my view, just from watching these cycles over the years, it's actually quite important that government look back and that we have institutional arrangements which require that to happen, because in the absence of those arrangements it simply hasn't happened. A second feature of the bill, of these amendments, which I think is probably generally agreed, is that the government is a bit more transparent over issues such as the interaction of fiscal and monetary policy and the impact of decisions today on future generations. And I just want to deal with those briefly. With respect to decisions, the effect of decisions today on future generations, what we learnt from, I think, from recent years, the last decade or so, is that relatively small decisions can have, or decisions that looks relatively small in the short term, can have significant long-term outcomes. It's quite telling, in my view, that every time Treasury has done a long-term fiscal forecast, the outcome of that has looked better than the previous forecast, and that's going right back to 2010. We now have, back to 2000. We now have 12 or 13 years of these forecasts in different forms. Each one paints a more favourable picture of our ability to manage an ageing population. That may be, some might say, well, that's false comfort. But I think the provisions of this bill are going to ensure that that's pretty clear what the track is out in the future, and that governments are well aware of the longer term implications, both positive and negative. The other feature that's the other amendment that's part of this bill is around the interaction of fiscal and monetary policy. That is really just codifying, I think, what's been practiced over for different governments over the last 10 or 15 years. It's pretty clear that it's to everybody's benefit that the Reserve Bank, in taking its positions about monetary policy, has a good understanding of what government's fiscal policy is. And as far as I can see, that's always been satisfactory communication between governments and an independent Reserve Bank over that issue. So I wouldn't imagine that this amendment is going to make much difference to the practice, but it will codify it. So, Mr. Speaker, this is just adding a couple more tools to the toolkit that New Zealand governments have to retain prudent fiscal management. If there's an area which I think still needs further work in the future, it is the way that governments deal with capital. Governments have large balance sheets. There's going to be a bit of a tendency, I think, for the policy focus to shift to capital and the balance sheet away from operational spending, because operational spending is now quite transparent. Changes in it have to be made transparent. There's a general public expectation that we should have a budget in surplus and then make prudent dispositions of those surpluses. That is going to tend to push the political debate into other ways of redistribution, other ways of shifting value around in our community, and those are going to be much less transparent if they're conducted through the balance sheet, and I think that might be a fair way to represent some of the current policies of the opposition, for instance, but it's not to say all governments might be tempted to push in that direction. So getting some greater transparency around the use of government's balance sheet and changes in the value of that balance sheet driven by policy decisions is probably one of the next challenges in the further evolution of our Fiscal Responsibility Act. So, Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House. It takes us further along a track which has been good for New Zealand. It's had broad support, and I hope that that support will be reflected in the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you.